What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm tackling something a little bit more abstract. I'm going to be talking about a cube design principle, and that is familiarity. I want to talk about how I use familiarity in my cube designs, how I value this as a tool, as a cube designer and curator. Personally, I find that conversations and resources regarding abstract concepts like this to be the most meaningful and important for me in terms of understanding things. If you understand things kind of at a fundamental level, it's a lot easier to build up than to take things that you don't necessarily understand fundamentally and use those tools to build something backwards. You usually, when you're building fundamentals the ground up, you get the best results, at least in my experience. And it's also the most difficult to tackle these concepts as a creator. So I'm tackling something that's a little bit daunting this week, but I'm going to try to do my best, and hopefully you find it interesting and useful in your own cube journey. So first, let's talk about what I mean when I use the term familiarity in the context of cube. The word resonance and the concept of resonance is something that gets a fair amount of attention in the cube design sphere. Resonance is distinct from familiarity. They are similar, but they are meaningfully different. When it comes to resonance, if something resonates with you, that can be wizards and knights versus dragons as an aspect of fantasy. It's something that you really look for, something that really makes sense to you in a fantasy setting. There are certain things you expect to see, things that are meaningful for you to see, and they just kind of make sense to you whether you know the source material or not. When it comes to familiarity, the question is more specifically, do you know the source material? It's different to have a concept of dragons making sense in fantasy to knowing Smaug is the dragon, the kind of antagonist in The Hobbit. So resonance is a matter of things generally making sense to you, having a vibe that speaks to you, and familiarity is more literally, do you know this thing? Have you seen this? Have you heard about this? And just right off the bat, there's an aspect of that. Cube designers is sort of a version of game design, but there's a reason that I spend so much time designing cubes and I don't spend so much time designing my own games. It's easier to approach, sure, but then it's also easier to teach and to roll up to a group of people that play the game Magic. I'm borrowing Magic's rules engine. I am using Magic's game pieces because players will be familiar with them already. It removes a lot of the friction in both approaching and learning a new environment, and it's just going to be easier to find people to play with if I'm just playing a version of a game that people already know. I don't really have to teach you very much. There's going to be things to learn, there's going to be aspects of discovery, but starting from a place where some aspects of what I am coming to the table with are familiar gets us to the point where we're actually playing games much more quickly. Many years ago, just the concept of a cube at all in Magic was pretty new. You had to kind of explain, okay, we're drafting, it's like retail limited, except it's a curated list of cards. Today, a lot more people know what a cube is. Cube is one of the more popular ways to play Magic, so you are kind of leaning on that general sense of familiarity to make it easy to find games and to play in spaces that you want to play in. For me personally, familiarity is something that I really value when it comes to playing constructed Magic. I play quite a lot of constructed Magic still. Honestly, most days when I'm drinking my cup of black coffee every morning, I play a little bit of Standard on Magic Arena, and a big part of the appeal for me there is that I'm generally going to know what my deck's output is. There's something familiar, something that is just comfortable and not that difficult to approach. The game of Magic is fundamentally complex. The games are going to be difficult no matter how familiar you are. The environments can change, constructed formats, they rotate, cards get banned, whatever. But having that bit of familiarity makes it easy as something to just roll up and just get to playing games, even if things change from matchup to matchup, week to week, month to month. I've still been casting slick shot show off through it all. And so that's something that I really value as part of the Magic experience for me. It's just that it's a game that I have played for over 20 years now. I know a lot of the cards, and I can play a deck that I know with very little friction in terms of just waking up and playing games. So that's something I really value in Constructed. And when I talk about being a constructed player who wants to translate what I like about constructed to cube, that sense of familiarity, that comfort, is actually usually what I mean. I think that a lot of people, they think about more specific principles of constructed. A number of people that have more constructed background as cube curators, they're maybe doing things like breaking singleton. You'll notice if you look over my designs, I don't do that a lot. That's not what I'm talking about translating. I don't really care about playing multiple copies of the same card so much as I do just knowing and liking all of the cards. I also don't really like hate cards or like sideboarding, and being able to shut off a strategy is a big part of constructed. I don't want to translate that to cube. I don't like that aspect of constructed. What I do like about constructed is that there's just cards that I know and like, that other players know and like, and we get to play a bunch of games with these things that we are all familiar with. There's not that much friction into showing up and playing games. And I think that that really speaks to a lot of the difference between cube designers and players that have more a constructed background versus more of a limited background, is that constructed players can often have some negative feelings about things like their format rotating. That's part of why the non-rotating formats are just more popular. And there's aspects of that, like people don't like it when their cards depreciate in value. That's part of what players don't like about rotation. It's talked about less, but really just the ability to play the same deck month in, month out, year in, year out. The fact that rotation is a barrier to that is, I think that's an aspect of why constructed players don't like rotation. And that's actually one of the bigger complaints about direct to modern sets like Modern Horizons. They're perceived as just changing the format too much. And again, players will loudly express the economic dissatisfaction with this. If the cards they bought are less playable, or now they are incentivized to spend all this money on new cards, players don't like that. It's talked about less, but it is important that something that is being ruffled here is that comfort and familiarity with the format. For example, when Modern Horizons 2 came out, shortly after that, that was kind of the biggest dip in how much Modern that I played. As somebody who really enjoys Prowess, that's a deck I play in Standard, it's the deck that I have played in Modern for several years. It was really frustrating for me when they printed Fury, and it's not like I couldn't go out and buy Furies. They were never that expensive even at their peak, but Fury was both not good in the deck that I liked, and it was the best red card in the format. It wasn't good in the red deck that I liked, and it was very strong against the red deck that I liked. So the thing that I was comfortable with and familiar with, it just changed too radically too quickly, and so I just didn't like the format as much. I certainly could have bought into some other deck. I could have picked up Furies and Griefs and played the Rakdos Scam deck. I would have no problem with that conceptually, but I just wanted to play the thing that I know. And that's really valuable to me as a player, and I know that that's really valuable to a lot of other players. But then going back to this being a difference between constructed players and limited players are often very excited when their version of rotation happens, when a new retail limited set launches and now there's a new puzzle to solve. There's a lot of excitement and exploration there. Constructed players do feel that excitement and sense of exploration as well. Rotation can be very fun, or a new set coming out can be very fun because you get to see what tools there are for your deck. You get to see what's going on with the other decks and kind of mess with your sideboard, or if the metagame changes, you change things in your main deck. Constructed players do enjoy that exploration as well. I do know that I enjoy tuning my deck for a given environment, provided things don't change too radically. And on the other side of that, when it comes to limited set design, the people that make Magic, a different retail limited set, they are certainly designed to be aesthetically distinct. There's always new mechanics, there's new puzzles to solve. You figure out how different things, even cards that are similar or reprints of things that we've seen before, fit into different environments and new contexts. There is that exploration. At the same time, if you ever listen to Rosewater's Drive to Work podcast, I'm just taking this from the head designer of Magic himself, a new limited environment is designed to be mostly the same Magic experience that you always get. Grizzly Bear with set mechanic is just as much an execution of good game design as it is a meme. You want to introduce 2-mana 2/2, a shape of creature that players are very familiar with. We've cast a lot of Grizzly Bears or bears of different stripes in our time playing Magic. And the exploration is finding out how different is it if the grizzly bear makes a food token, or proliferates, or fights something. There's just all kinds of different things that a card that is generally very similar can do. And you're going to have combat tricks and removal spells, and the game is generally going to be about creatures, and the colors are going to have certain mechanics and keywords and density of creatures that are consistent in the color pie, and these things hold up from set to set. Again, so for the most part, even though you have new puzzles to solve and a new environment, there is still something at play here, something that's a fundamental aspect of the way that they design retail limited environments, is that even though you are seeing a bunch of cards for the first time, even though there's a lot of new content, they are still very much using familiarity as a tool in retail limited design, and so you can mostly know what's going on. Even though there is a new puzzle, you still know the general rules of Magic. You still have seen things very similar to a lot of what is going on in the set. So they're trying not to make something super overly complex. They are appealing to that sense of familiarity and the associated feeling of comfort that comes with being familiar with something. And so I am mostly just going through all of this to say that the sentiments of constructed players and limited players regarding both exploration and comfort are not that different. Both types of players there value both of those things, even if they wouldn't necessarily describe them as such. These are just fundamentally true aspects of playing constructed and of drafting retail limited. Both of these ways to play consistently offer new puzzles to solve, and both of these ways to play are designed with a sense of familiarity in mind to make players more comfortable just to walk up to the table in the first place. I do think that as a cube designer, a lot of the fun is presenting something that players have never seen before, to play in unique space, to show them a side of Magic that maybe they would have never considered on their own. Exploring a new space is very fun, and it is really exciting to solve those new puzzles. But take it from the people that make the game. Even if you are playing in really unique space, I do think it is really important to lean on some aspects of familiarity to give players some amount of stuff that they know. The game of Magic and the process of drafting have so much variance baked in. There's so much to explore just on a fundamental level that I really value using familiarity as a tool in my design to curb this. The game will basically always challenge you as a player, but it takes some work to make the experience comfortable and fun for players. And those are things that I consider my responsibilities as a cube designer. So those are the broad strokes on familiarity as a concept in Magic and why it's important for Cube. Now I want to talk about 3 different kinds of familiarity and how to approach each of them as a cube designer as a tool to make your cube more approachable, more familiar, more comfortable for your players. So those 3 kinds of familiarity, they're going to be familiarity with the entire cube itself, familiarity with archetypes, and familiarity with individual cards. So starting with familiarity with the cube itself, this is a bit self-explanatory. Either you have played the cube, or you have seen the cube list, or you have not. And there are a lot of players who are really excited to draft a cube for the first time, but then there also are a lot of players that are just going to be happier to play something that they can roll up and play without very much friction, something that they're familiar with, as the entire cube entity is going to be more comfortable, more fun, easier to commit their time to. So depending on how large your playgroup is, how dedicated they are, how many players you have that are really excited to try something new, it's often easier to just start with something really familiar, and there's inertia that comes with this. The Magic Online Vintage Cube is a consistent offering on the client now. It is the most well-known cube, it's the most drafted cube, and there's aspects of familiar with individual cards and archetypes in play there. I think players really are excited to draft with Black Lotus. We'll talk a little bit more about individual cards later. Just like the fact that you always know what to do when you see Black Lotus in a pack, you draft it. There are plenty of reasons that a player might prefer a powered cube over a non-powered cube or the other way around, but I think that a very significant factor at play for why you always see Powered Cube on Magic Online and why players really want to play Powered Cube on that client is just inertia. Player retention is just a lot easier than player acquisition. And once you become familiar with an environment, it generally just goes more quickly. You don't have to read as many cards in the draft or in the games, and things just play much more smoothly when you have an idea of how the games generally play out. Even if it's different from draft to draft, different from game to game, just that base familiarity, the difference between reading every card in the pack or reading half the cards in the pack and just being able to look at the arts and kind of knowing what's there and deciding what you want to do from a more comfortable position of generally knowing what everything does, it just moves so much quicker. And that's kind of the big barrier to drafting a cube for the first time. Even if everybody's very excited about it, it's still going to go a little bit slower the first time you draft it. And this is a hurdle every cube has to get over. The cube designer before the first play is usually going to be very familiar with the cube, at least in sense of knowing the card list and what they are thinking, what they're watching, what they want the cube to be about. And then other players are going to have to do more of that reading and seeing things for the first time. That's just something that's going to be an aspect of drafting the cube for the first time. And you can like share the list. Some people will be excited to look it over before they play. Some players, again, are just really excited to draft something new for the first time. But then as everybody gets more familiar with it, when you have a table where players don't have to read as many cards, then it is a lot easier to continue play a cube once you have gotten into the shape where it's played for the first time. And that's where I want to talk about familiarity with the cube itself as something that you could maybe level up your game with as a cube designer. I know that a lot of cube designers really stress about the balance or getting the cube to a playable state before anybody sees it. I guarantee you, I mean, this is what do they say about Magic? Like the day a new Magic set releases, within that one day, within some small number of hours, the player base at large will have played more with the cards than the designers. And if you play with 8, 4, 2, just getting your cube to a space where somebody else is looking at it, other people are playing it with you, they'll get more familiar and comfortable as players. They'll be more excited then to offer their feedback, to work on it with you, to play it again with you, and see how your ideas and their ideas pan out. Really, if you want to play a cube a lot of times, the first step is playing it once. Don't agonize over how your cube is going to play before anybody sees it, because naturally their understanding and your understanding is going to grow and evolve over time just by developing a sense of familiarity. And an aspect of that, you can't be too familiar with it, even if you know all the cards. Even if you could write down the entire cube list by heart, until you're drafting it and playing it, that's a barrier to your own familiarity. And also getting over that hurdle of other players' familiarity. Once people know about your cube and you have a cool idea and you drafted it once and they're excited to see how it changes, then it's less you saying, oh, I have this cube, is anybody able to play it? You start to get people asking when you're going to bring that cube around again. Like once it's a known quantity, once they've had some fun playing and talking about it, players are generally more excited to play it again. And you never get there if you never bring your cube out of the box in the first place. Inertia does work both ways. Once you start playing, it's easier to keep playing, and if you're not playing, it's pretty easy to continue not playing. And then the other thing that I want to encourage here for cube designers, I really value this as a player of any kind of game, really everything in life. I really value debriefing conversations when something is over. When I'm done with the draft at the end of a game or a match, I really enjoy kind of breaking down what happened in the game, what the decks are about, what the games are about with my opponent or anybody who was watching. And I really enjoy talking over the state of a cube, what's going on with the design, what the cube designer is thinking, or if I am the designer, sharing my thoughts and talking through how people felt about how things are in the current state of the cube after a draft. And that's really valuable for both the cube curator and the players in terms of shaping the environment and becoming more familiar with it. I know that a lot of cube designers really stress about having an elevator pitch and writing really fancy and in-depth breakdowns of their cubes on Cube Cobra. And if you enjoy that, great. But really just the conversations that happen at the table when you're drafting are so much more valuable, at least for me, regarding understanding and figuring out what's going on in a cube. An example of a cube that I recently drafted for the first time and have drafted a few times since is my friend Andy's Mono Black cube. So all black cards. I've played color restricted cubes before. I've even played a mono black cube before, come to think of it. But different designers have different ideas about what they want to support, what they want to have be powerful, what their idea of just like a power level or balance or fun or archetype support, whatever. There's a lot of different ways to do it, even with a very specific design constraint. And the first time I drafted that cube, there was some other stuff going on where we drafted with five, and I thought that we were seriously going to play a game of Star Magic after, but everybody else thought that that was a joke, and I actually really like Star Magic. I think it's very fun. Set that aside for now. I drafted a deck as if I was going to play multiplayer, and then we start playing one-on-one matches, and I quickly learned that the fact that I drafted no removal spells because I was going to rely on the other players in the multiplayer game to take care of anything that was scary was massively to my detriment in the games, and after my first match, it was pretty clear that my deck was not going to be competitive in two-player games, but I did learn a lot seeing the other decks in action, and also seeing the failings of my deck was really valuable for me. I was playing games where for a while there was some back and forth and they were kind of competitive about making good attacks and blocks. So I definitely saw what Andy had constructed was an environment that was kind of a modest power level, creatures attacking, blocking is a lot of what's going on. But eventually, some of the cards are stronger than others, that's inevitable. But more importantly, some synergy would unfold. Some of the cards would play together and combine in a way where just making attacks and blocks without any interaction, it just wasn't going to get you there, which is good. It is good that my deck that I drafted for multiplayer was not competitive in 1v1 games. And then I learned a lot. I became more familiar with the cube. And we talked after the draft, and it really stuck with me. Andy said that one of the things, like kind of a first principle for the cube, is he wanted the card Phyrexian Gargantua to be strong and kind of built down from that. If you don't know the card, it's a 6 mana 4/4 for 4 black black. When it enters, you draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. So very modest rate, very cool card from Apocalypse. Building around that card alone signals that the games in general are going to go kind of long. And that was my experience. And as the games go along, players will have some synergies unfold. You have more opportunities with your draw step to draw the cards that will combine and do something powerful. And then it will also be important to have some amount of interaction, some amount of removal, and to wait and pick your spots to use that in the most effective ways. So you can learn a lot even drafting a bad deck, even drafting a deck that's totally not competitive. As long as you are curious and you're having these conversations about what's going on in the environment, you can become really familiar really quickly. My other drafts after that, obviously I was reading fewer cards, I kind of know more what's going on in the cube, and just having a better sense of what the cube is about, what the games are about, what the decks are about. The environment gets a lot more comfortable very quickly just from some small amount of exposure. So if you want to build familiarity, you just got to get the cube in other people's hands, and they will quickly figure it out. They'll work with you. Maybe they'll teach you some things you didn't know about your own environment. And as you start playing, you'll get that inertia towards players and you becoming more familiar and wanting to play your cube more often. So that's familiarity with the cube itself. Now let's talk about familiarity with archetypes. Retail limited enjoyers will no doubt know that when they come out with new limited sets, you will always see every 2-color pair and some associated archetype. That's kind of how they design the sets. That is how they make them approachable to a wide range of players. And a lot of cube designers kind of take that and run with it. They have archetypes that are seated in some number of colors, and archetype design is a really fundamental and important part of a lot of cube designs. For me personally, I focus a lot less on archetypes. I don't think, okay, do I have an archetype for this 2-color deck? I tend to play more in broad themes and macro archetypes. Certainly for 180 card cubes, I like to have the cube be about a small number of things just to ensure that all the cards are playable. Just in the general with Magic, you have aggro, mid-range control, you can have some amount of combo, you naturally get some amount of variety, and just using generally playable cards with good rates or comparable rates for everything else in the cube is more important than them being good per se. But just having cards that are generally playable relative to the environment is going to give you a lot of diversity in what actually shows up in decks. So I don't stress about archetypes as much as a lot of other players and designers do, and I think it's way less important for Cube than it is for Retail Limited. But archetypes are still important. As a drafter, you are trying to draft a deck, and your deck generally should be about something. If all you're doing is taking the strongest card and you have the best mana fixing and your deck doesn't care about anything, it's not the most engaging or fun experience. You want to try to explore some kind of theme or synergy. That's really where a lot of the fun of it comes into play. And figuring out how to draft a new archetype or a familiar archetype in a new environment is a really fun kind of exploration. But there is an aspect of familiarity that's going to be important here, certainly as a designer. No matter how many archetypes or how strongly you value having differentiated archetypes supported in your cube, you want to be familiar with what they are, and you want to be able to have those conversations with players. And so something that I do a lot of, certainly before the first time I ever draft a cube with players, but it's something that I continue to do as I work on cubes, even cubes that I've had together for many years, is just doing bot drafts on Cube Cobra. If there's an archetype that I'm trying to support, I of course want to make sure that it's actually supported. So a cube that I'm working right now is largely built around the card Soul Flayer. It's a creature that can gain the keywords of whatever creatures you delve to cast it from your graveyard. So for example, it cares about having creatures with haste, lifelink, double strike in your graveyard. So I want to make sure I have enough support for this card. And because double strike is one of the stronger abilities to give it, it's just really strong to have double strike as a keyword. I've also been kind of working on a double strike deck. So just use those as two examples. While I'm working on this cube that is largely built around Soulflayer, I want to make sure that there is a Soulflayer archetype that's supported. So when I'm doing the bot drafts, I try to force that. Forcing archetypes to make sure that they're there is what I'm trying to reinforce here. If you want it to be a part in your environment, stress test it and make sure it's there. So I will do a bot draft. I'll try to come up with a deck that I'd be happy to play with a Soulflayer. And of course, you don't play the games, and the bots on Cube Cobra are kind of weird. Doesn't always make sense what they're valuing in the draft, but you get a decent idea of how much friction there is when you try to draft that. And then I'll try to draft like the double strike deck, so I'll be drafting the creatures with double strike, and I'll try to keep an eye out for cards that are really appealing for that archetype in the draft, or if I think of something that's not yet in the cube that would be really good to see, I will try to make room for that kind of effect. So with like a double strike deck, I'm going to want cards that give my double strike creatures more power and toughness. So like equipment and pump spells, those are really appealing. And as I think of things that make sense, I'll kind of add those as I'm doing these bot drafts. Meanwhile, I'm also keeping an eye out for cards that are maybe the same color combination as the archetypes I'm trying to support that don't really fit into those archetypes, or cards that I just generally don't find appealing. If I, as the cube designer, don't think they make sense in my design, or I don't think that they're that fun, then who is going to like them? So I do these bot drafts, forcing the things that I'm trying to support, both keeping an eye out for things that I want to add to better support these archetypes, and things that just don't really seem to fit my design to make space for the things that I do want to have in the cube. And that's a really useful exercise, but that's really just reinforcing my own familiarity with the environment and going towards the things that make sense to me. What I actually find more important at this stage is then just trying to draft archetypes that players generally are familiar with and comfortable drafting and might be looking for to draft in a given cube. Things that are just fundamental to Magic. Couple examples. I usually want to see what happens if I try to draft mono red, because some number of players do like just drafting mono red aggressive decks. I want to see what happens if I draft blue white control. I'm not a big blue white control enjoyer, but I have a lot of friends that are, a lot of Magic players like that. Jund mid-range, just green, black, red, some threats, some kill spells. Some people are going to try to draft that deck. If you have like mana fixing as an aspect of green color identity in your cube, I like to stress test what the green-based 5-color deck looks like, because that's also something that I know is just pretty well known, pretty popular, a lane that people are going to try to draft. Even with the most intentional design, if you are trying to do something very specific in your environment, players are going to draft what makes sense to them. And they are not as familiar with your cube as you are. And I do want to say that the point of forcing mono red in my cube that's not designed for you to draft mono red just to see what it looks like, the point is not that I expect other players to draft that mono red deck or that I don't think players will challenge themselves. Of course they will. Constructed and limited players, every Magic player loves exploration. They love trying something new. The reason you want to see what these familiar lanes look like is so you can see what happens if players have to fall back into what is open. If you have an archetype that's seeded, if I first pick Soulflayer, and then whatever else is happening in the draft, for some reason I am not getting past or I am not wheeling the cards that I believe are important for me to draft this deck, I need to have an off ramp. And if your cube just generally plays in the space of familiar Magic, if you just have generally supported, controlling, aggressive, and mid-range archetypes in colors that our players are going to be familiar drafting those archetypes in, then your cube has this baseline of playability that will ensure even if things don't work out, if things are not aligned with your vision, if players are not seeing your vision, if things just get weird, there's at least something that can happen where normal-ish and enjoyable games of Magic can be played. And that's really important for playability. And even if you make a lot of changes, even if you end up not liking the cube because things didn't work out, you get to at least play it that first time. And if you do decide to stick with the cube, you learn a lot about what you want to do to move it towards your goals and to make it replayable. It's going to be really valuable. If players end up playing blue-white control and mono-red in your cube that's designed to be way more adventurous than that, the debrief conversation after the fact is going to teach you so much. What caused players to draft these decks? What would be appealing? What is so strong in those archetypes that you maybe want to remove so players don't end up at those lanes? What would they be looking for to do something different? And you want to kind of keep a baseline of playability. At least I think I really value that baseline of playability in Cube, while then getting players the tools that they need or want to explore the space that you are trying to design into as well. To give an example of a cube that I think really does this very well, it's actually my pick. I think this was, for my money, the best designed Spotlight cube we ever had on Magic Online. The best designed cube we ever had Magic Online was Carmen Comparin's Proliferate cube. The cube has a very specific theme. The entire premise is that if you have a card that has the proliferate mechanic, which allows you to increase the numbers of one kind of counter on any permanent or player when it resolves, that's what the mechanic does, that's just going to do something. You're going to control permanents that have counters in some capacity, be they creatures, planeswalkers, enchantments with some weird stuff going on, artifacts with some weird stuff going on, whatever. You can proliferate them. Your players are going to have counters. That's just an aspect of the gameplay. But then it really reinforces a lot of Magic fundamentals. And one of the aggressive themes in the deck, there's like a affinity thing going on where you have Arcbound Ravager, of course, like modular, a huge +1/+1 counter theme. But then with red, you do start to run out. It's pretty easy to get like Sultai decks that care about +1/+1 counters. Simic has a history of counter mechanics. Celestia is going to give you all kinds of +1/+1 counters. Tons of things you can do in those four colors. Red is a little bit lacking, and Carmen does just kind of lean in and gives you just some generally useful red aggressive tools. And there are just removal spells. There is some amount of controlling aspects. You can just play blue-white control in the environment. So in general, you're going to be rewarded for really leaning in and doing what the cube tells you to do. Put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on stuff, but still the fundamental aspects of Magic are all there. Like there's this is it artifact matters kinds of deck that there are aspects of it that can use those +1/+1 counters. That modular stuff, that Arcbound Ravager stuff is going to be really useful in the blue-red aggressive deck. But then it also is just adding some cards to make sure that you can always play Magic and draft something that's approachable, familiar, and that makes sense to you. The card Atog, it plays in that artifact theme, doesn't use counters, it just plays really well with a number of cards that do. It helps round the environment out. The card Lightning Bolt doesn't play with counters in any capacity, but just having familiar cards like that players are excited to see, that they know how to play with, that they can just put into a deck, that's going to be pretty important for making the cube just a little bit more approachable. And when it's approachable, that means it's playable. If it's playable, that means it's replayable. So I just think that stuff is really important in design. And another thing I like to look out for in those bot drafts, and certainly when I'm soliciting feedback from players, is cards that signal archetypes that maybe are a little bit supported, but just aren't fully there, and that players can't really lean on. I'm going to use an example from that mono black cube. Andy was trying out kind of like an artifact matters themes, because you do get some amount of colorless card in the environment, but it's a little bit dangerous space because black does not really answer artifacts. There's very few black cards in the entire history of Magic that do anything to specifically answer artifacts, so you don't want those to be the strongest cards. But there are some black cards that do care about artifacts, a little bit from like Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which is a hugely impactful set in terms of modern Magic. So you get more and more artifact matter stuffs kind of every set now since the release of Neon Dynasty. And there's like some artifact matter stuff. I know Black's color pie. I'm very familiar with just Magic design generally. So I knew drafting that cube that black artifacts matter, unless I see something like a Steel Overseer is not really where I want to be, unless I see really powerful individual cards, whereas most of the rest of the cube is a lot of very specific synergy pieces that are a lot more modest. Whereas I know in the debrief after one of our drafts, a player expressed that they picked something early that was kind of like a black artifact synergy piece, and it didn't seem very supported. And it's the kind of thing where even if you use the entire history of Magic, it is just difficult to support artifacts matter in a mono black cube. So when that kind of thing happens, if you observe that in a bot draft, if you have that conversation in a debrief after a draft, then you then ask the player, you ask yourself, is trying to have just this little more sampling, a little bit more of a range of what's happening, is it adding or subtracting from the environment? Which is a question for you to answer yourself. Like, there's certainly some small synergies that are worth exploring. Not everything has to be a full archetype, but getting a feel for what is going to be generally familiar to players, getting a feel for what players are going to pick up on, what is exciting or what they think is going to happen, just getting a feel for their expectations is important and is something to be mindful of. What archetypes players are going to try to draft. Not everybody knows what you know, and you are the person who is most familiar with your cube. So you want to send good signals, you want to send consistent messages in your design. So that was familiarity on an archetype level. Now it's finally time to talk about familiarity on an individual card level. This is actually the most straightforward and easiest way to implement familiarity as a tool in cube design. It's something that my designs tend to feature very heavily. If you look at my Tempo Tubert, that cube is largely modeled after legacy and modern formats with different flavors of Delver of Secrets decks. That list is long on iconic constructed cards. Delver of Secrets, Tarmogoyf, Mother of Runes, Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Lightning Bolt. Just a really long list of cards that if you've played a lot of Modern and Legacy historically, you will just know them at a glance. Not a ton of new stuff you'll have to read for the first time, but the environment still plays in pretty unique and fun ways. It's one that's a huge hit for players that have nostalgia for Modern and Legacy 10 or so years ago. It is one where if you're a newer player, you will have to read more cards, so I do try to sample the play group when I know that I'm playing with the old crew that I used to travel to PTQs and SCG Opens with that are familiar with old Modern and Legacy. That one's just a no-brainer to bust out. But then for other designs, I use cards. I mean, that design also has a lot of cards that players do just know. Delver of Secrets is kind of enduring in an iconic way. Tarmogoyf is as well. So that can even still appeal to newer players. But then I do try to use these massively iconic cards. And this is really a lot of what I mean when I talk about translating constructed to cube, is just using those familiar cards. So when I was designing the original recipe Tubert, I made a pretty serious point to include cards that players would know and they would be excited about. Kind of the poster boy there, Jace the Mind Sculptor was kind of a non-negotiable starting point for that cube. I for sure wanted that card. And some of that was that Jace is a historically powerful card, but it was less important that it was powerful. That's an aspect of it being exciting to see in a pack, which I did care about, but that wouldn't be true if you had never heard of it. It's a lot less exciting and fun to see a powerful card you've never seen before. Not always, but it is more immediately clear and resonant when you see something that you know to be powerful, and it kind of gives you something familiar to approach at the start of a draft, and kind of building that cube out from there. Bloodbraid Elf, if you were playing Standard back during Jund Standard, was kind of the natural predator of Jace at the time. So using things that were clearly aspects of balance of historical constructed formats is a big thing that influences a lot of my designs. And you don't have to go specifically there. I'm just speaking to what I really like. But using just cards that you expect people to know, that can go a long way in ensuring that even the first draft of the cube can go a little bit quicker just by ensuring that kind of baseline of familiarity with cards going into things. I think we've all had that experience where you or somebody else has to read a lot of cards in a cube and it really slows things down. It's hard to conceptualize what's going to happen. And I know for me it's a bigger deal when I have to read things and I kind of don't know what the games are going to be about or what I should be drafting. Drafting it again, I'll become more familiar. It's not like a non-starter, but too much complexity can definitely slow things down. It can give players kind of a sense of decision paralysis when you don't know what to do. And in my experience, the further you are from drafting something coherent in an environment, the less you're going to learn from that individual draft experience. So that initial barriers to complexity, the less familiarity you're going to have with the cube from the jump, it does kind of cascade. It does make the learning curve a little bit higher. So this tool of just using cards that people are going to be familiar with on an individual card basis can go a long way to increase the familiarity with the general cube and the archetypes. You get to learning those things faster if you don't have to learn all of the game pieces as well. And I do also want to say that if you are not using a lot of familiar cards, simplicity is a really good substitute for familiarity as well. So is loudness. So first, simplicity, just vanilla creatures, of course, really easy to know what's going on there. You have a mana cost, you have power and toughness. French vanilla creatures that just have some keyword like vigilance, first strike, not a lot to wrap your head around. You can do things with like 1 or 2 lines of text without really any difficulty. They don't take very long to read. There's usually not a lot to consider. So using mostly simple cards makes it kind of easy to accelerate towards figuring out archetypes and learning what's going on in the cube at large. And then when I say loudness, what I mean is cards that really tell you what they're about. This is something that Andy really did well in his mono black cube. There was a lot of cards that I had to read because the power level was a little bit more modest. A lot of the cards were cards that were more designed for retail limited. It would be stuff that really I would never, maybe I'd see it once when I'm looking over sets during preview season, but when they don't translate into constructed, I quickly forget about them, even if I finish reading them in the first place. I tune a lot of stuff that looks like it's probably going to be a limited card out when I'm doing preview season just because there's so many cards now. But Andy had a good sampling of familiar cards, stuff like Bloodghast, Gravecrawler. Gravecrawler is a good example of loudness. It specifically calls out zombies. You are going to need to control a zombie to cast Gravecrawler from your graveyard. That one is also pretty iconic. It's a very familiar card. But using a more obscure example, he has a card called Death Priest of Mirkul, which is from Adventures in the Forgotten Realm. It's 2 black for a 2/2 Tiefling Cleric. It says skeletons, vampires, and zombie you control get +1/+1. And at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 1. If you do, create a 1/1 black skeleton creature token. So the cube just supports all 3 of those creature types. Skeletons, vampires, zombies. This is a really good way to signal something loud. If you're doing a typal theme, it tends to be the case that you'll have some kind of lord. That's a very approachable example of loudness. But let's also talk about a card a little bit more specific that does loudly communicate some things, and it also is kind of a self-contained card, so I think this is a great cube inclusion. It's Gumdrop Poisoner. It's 2 and a black for a 3/2 human warlock. It has an adventure, Tempt with Treats, a 1 black mana instant. You create a food token. And then the creature is a 3/2 with lifelink, and when Gumdrop Poisoner enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. So this card is just a self-contained quest. Reading the card will explain the card, so it's fairly simple in that regard. You can make a food token, the food will gain you some life, and then if you sacrifice the food and cast the poisoner on the same turn, you can give a creature -3/-3 because you just gained 3 life from your food. But then the card also has lifelink. It makes a food token that signals the potential that maybe food is a theme, that maybe life gain is a theme. There's other ways to gain life and to gas up your gumdrop poisoners enter the battlefield ability. Both of those things are true in Andy's Mono Black Cube. There's a life gain theme, there's some payoffs for food specifically. Those things overlap as part of why this card is so simple. It's just two halves of a card that play really well together. So it's a card you can fairly easily read and understand, and then it also tells you things about the cube. So it's something that maybe you would be familiar with, maybe you wouldn't. If you're not, it doesn't take a ton to get familiar with this card. I think that also when cards have independent clauses, the fact that the adventure here gives you kind of life gain on suspend with a food token, and then you have a card that cares about gaining life, when those abilities really play well together, that's a lot easier to understand than when you have things that are a bit disjointed. Disjointed abilities can be a pretty big complexity barrier, but this card I think reads pretty clean, and it also will tell you things about supported archetypes in the cube. So it's a card that is maybe obscure, but it's pretty elegant, relatively simple, and it's very loud. So it does accelerate you towards understanding and familiarity on an archetype level, which accelerates you towards familiarity on a cube level. And that notion of reading the card, explaining the card, and just cards being generally more simple and approachable, that has gotten more important to me recently as they make more and more cards, and there's more and more reasons why you would not have heard of a card. I try to curb the number of cards that, if players haven't heard of them, I definitely don't want them to be very complex. Or if I do, now and again you find a weirdo that maybe doesn't read the cleanest, but it's perfect for your environment. I just try to keep the volume of that kind of stuff pretty low. It's fine to have one weirdo and people pass around and maybe nobody even reads it because it's in a pack where there's some stuff that they would rather draft, some stuff that they enjoy playing anyway, and maybe you can scoop it up later than you should on power level. But then it really slows things down. It is a huge barrier to both the fun of the cube night and long-term familiarity with the cube if half the pack gets to be a bunch of weirdos that nobody's ever heard of that take a couple reads. So you can have a small sprinkling of those commander cards that are really crunchy that nobody's ever heard of, but I do make a point to keep that stuff light. And I'm not advocating for a specific quota of familiar cards. You don't have to pore over your cube and make sure that it's half iconic or anything really granular like that. But I do try to be mindful when I'm starting a project, and where I find it to be very useful when you're getting those last few cards to make sure you have a fully draftable cube. I know that some players have a ton of cards and you're whittling down, and that's true for some of my projects as well. But if I have like 175 with 180, a really easy thing to do that will make it pretty approachable for the first draft, just add a Doomblade, add a Oblivion Ring, add a Flame Tongue Kavu, whatever the appropriately powerful version of just these familiar cards and effects is. Just round the cube out with that kind of stuff, because players will know what's going on with those, and you'll have a pretty good idea whether you like them or not, and then based off of feedback you get from players, you can turn them into something that you do find more interesting, even if you couldn't think of it right away. At least for that first draft, those cards that people know will make that first draft more approachable, more familiar for everybody. And that's going to be a wrap on today's discussion of familiarity as a cube design tool. So kind of the three principles there: familiar with the cube at large, familiarity with archetypes, and familiarity on an individual card basis, and how you can kind of utilize all three of these things and work on making your cube more approachable. It'll make it more familiar, and generally the more familiar it gets more quickly, the more fun you can have with the cube, at least I find. I know a huge part of the appeal for designing cubes, you want to express yourself, maybe you have a really weird out there idea and you're excited to share it with people. All I ask is that you don't fight the familiar. Even if you want to do something that's kind of out there that people haven't experienced exactly before, it will be to your benefit to use some tools of familiarity to kind of get things off the ground and get people interested in the design in the first place. And I do just want to say that a lot of people are intimidated by cube, and we kind of get desensitized to this as we design a lot of cubes, or if you have a regular cube play group, certainly people that are very excited to try new cubes. A very common comment that I get about the original recipe Tubert, or more recently my Magic Foundation Starter Collection Tubert, is that people really appreciate that I took something that was kind of intimidated. A lot of people are intimidated to take that first step into Cube Draft, and I took something kind of demystified some of the complexity, broke things down, and made it more approachable. So a lot of people's first cube, which is awesome for me, it's so cool to hear and see, was the original recipe Tubert, and just taking something that uses stuff that they're more familiar with instead of just throwing them in the deep end. I do try to be very mindful that players have a different range of experiences, and like I was saying, kind of with the tempo Tubert, that being something for old heads, for old school legacy and modern players, using familiarity with a tool, but then also know your audience, know what they are more likely to be familiar with. Drafting itself, just even drafting, if you want to say, I know that a lot of players learn Magic by playing Commander now, and there's some discussion about Commander being really complicated, and it is, but it's kind of less important to get the rules right if you're playing Commander as your first game, and it's a lot harder to draft a deck than to open a precon, even if the games are more complicated from the fact after that. It still is pretty daunting to actually draft a deck, and I try to be mindful of that. And so using familiarity as a tool is something that I really value in my designs, that I know that a lot of players do appreciate in my designs. And so hopefully this overview today is useful and interesting and provides some food for thought in your own designs. And either way, thank you so much for taking the time to listen, for liking, sharing, reviewing, subscribing, anything you do to support the podcast. And I will be back next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.